When it comes to the Old West, they don't get much more famous than Jesse James. According to many, James was a hero, a freedom fighter who continued resisting Northern aggression long after the Civil War came to an end. But to his victims and their families, Jesse was nothing more than a cold-blooded killer, one who used the war as an excuse to lead a life of violence and destruction. But where does the truth lie? What exactly occurred during Jesse's childhood that turned him to a life of crime? How old was he when he killed his first man? How'd he wind up surviving not one but two separate gunshot wounds to the chest? And is it true he really hooked up with his own cousin? Join me today as we delve into the life of Jesse James, including his upbringing in Missouri and his time as a teenage killer riding with the likes of Bloody Bill Anderson. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Jesse Woodson James was born in Clay County, Missouri on September 5th, 1847. His father, Robert, was a hemp farmer by trade, in addition to being a Baptist minister. But I suppose being a man of the cloth don't necessarily make you immune to gold fever. And when gold was discovered in California, Robert headed west, alone, leaving his wife Zerelda and 3 young children behind in Missouri. And just 5 months later, Reverend James was dead. To quote historian T.J. Stiles, there would be no funeral, no burial, and no headstone. Robert had met his end in the California goldfields from cholera in September of 1850. Now, obviously, this was a devastating loss for the James family, but Robert's widow, Zerelda, was nothing if not resilient. Described by various sources as courageous, shrewd, and remarkable, the nearly 6-foot-tall Zerelda had a devotion to her children that bordered on the ferocious. But be that as it may, things would get worse before they started getting better. Shortly after Robert's death, many of the James family belongings were auctioned off to pay his debts. And by April of 1851, things had gotten so bad that Zerelda was taking a collection at her late husband's church just to keep the children fed. She would eventually remarry, though, to a farmer twice her age named Benjamin Sims, almost certainly a marriage of convenience. Jesse and the other kids weren't even allowed to live on the Sims farm. They stayed with a friend of their dearly departed fathers until the newlyweds separated that following June. Sims would be dead in another 6 months, and a little over a year after that, Zerelda tied the knot for the third and final time, swapping nuptials with a doctor by the name of Reuben Samuel. And make no mistake about it, Zerelda was definitely the one wearing the pants. Hell, she even made Reuben quit medicine so he could work the farm on a full-time basis. And for a while at least, life on the farm was good. Well, for everyone other than the slaves, that is. Neighbors would gather periodically to slaughter animals, meat was cured and smoked, fruit was jarred, and all the other little chores that come with country living. Jesse's mama and stepdaddy would welcome a baby girl in 1858 they named Sarah, and in time they'd add 3 more, John, Fanny, and Archie. By 1860, according to the federal census, a 12-year-old Jesse was attending school with his older brother Frank and little sister Susan. I don't think any of them could have predicted the change that was coming, not just for them, but the nation at large. And by change, of course, I do mean the Civil War. Long story short, Missouri was a border state. It was also very divided when it came to the issues of slavery and secession. You know the old trope about the Civil War being brother against brother and neighbor against neighbor? Well, that rings especially true for Missouri. By the year 1860, its population had exploded to around 1 million people, roughly 10% of whom were slaves. By contrast, in the deep southern states like Louisiana and Georgia, slaves made up closer to around 45% of the population. So yeah, Missouri was a slave state, but it wasn't quite as entrenched in slavery as other areas. And while around 40,000 Missourians would end up serving in the Confederate Army, over 100,000 more fought for the North. As for the James family, they were ardent supporters of the Southern cause. Not only did they themselves own slaves, but the area where they lived was known as Little Dixie. Now, if you listen to the recent episode I did on Silas Soule, you're already pretty familiar with the strife that plagued Missouri and Kansas in the years leading up to the war. I won't repeat myself too much here, but long story short, both pro- and anti-slavery factions flocked to the area looking to sway public sentiment. And in time, these factions would resort to violence. For the most part, though, none of this had a direct impact on the James family. leastways not till the war officially began in April of 1861. Jesse's older brother Frank would answer the call a month later when he enlisted with the Missouri State Guard under Sterling Price. And by that August, Frank was already engaging Yankee troops at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. He also came down with a pretty serious case of the measles. And when General Price pulled his men out of Springfield, they were forced to leave the ailing Frank behind. He was taken prisoner, but released shortly thereafter and sent home, after pinky swearing to be a good boy. And home is where he stayed until May of 1863, when he once more took up the fight, this time with William Quantrell and his merry band of bushwhackers. Don't worry, we will get back to Jesse James here shortly, I promise. I'm just setting the stage right now. Little history foreplay, if you will, just to put everything in context and get your juices flowing. Now, speaking of William Quantrell, I am planning on doing a series on him in the very near future, but if you don't mind, I would like to give a quick overview. Born in Ohio in 1837, Quantrell, believe it or not, was a school teacher. At least he was until he killed a man in 1856. By the following year, Quantrell was living in Kansas, and later still, he'd sign on as a teamster for the Army, traveling as far west as Salt Lake City. But by 1859, he was right back in Kansas. Interestingly enough, Quantrell had previously been opposed to slavery. He was even an ardent admirer of the abolitionist James Lane. However, by 1860, things were changing. Quantrell started going by the alias of Charlie Hart and hanging out with border ruffians, stealing livestock and helping to chase down escaped slaves. When the Civil War kicked off, he headed to Texas, but soon lit out for the Cherokee Nation. It's there where Quantrell befriended Joel Mays, captain of the Confederate Cherokees under General Stan Wadey. And when the Cherokees rode east into Missouri, Quantrell was right there with them, soaking up all he could learn about the fine art of guerrilla warfare. Finally, in late 1861, he formed his own company of irregulars known as Quantrell's Raiders, which included such luminaries as George Todd and Bloody Bill Anderson. This wasn't the only group of bushwhackers there in Missouri, but they would become the most well-known. Under Quantrell's command, the Raiders fought more like the indigenous than regular soldiers, striking hard and fast and then dispersing into smaller groups to evade capture, oftentimes donning the blue uniforms of their vanquished foes in the process. And as the war progressed, the behavior of these guerrillas grew more and more savage. Murder was the norm. Prisoners were rarely taken, and the dead were oftentimes mutilated. And yeah, as I mentioned earlier, it's this same band of cutthroats who took in Frank James in the spring of 1863. Now, as to why Frank decided to join the Raiders as opposed to the actual Confederate Army, we really don't know. There are stories of him being mistreated and arrested by the Missouri Provisional Militia. Maybe that's what inspired him. Or perhaps Frank just felt more comfortable riding with folks he was familiar with. Whatever the case, on May 19, 1863, Frank would assist Quantrell in attacking the U.S. troops garrisoned at Missouri City. Those who surrendered were executed, after which Frank and his fellow bushwhackers looted the town. From there, they continued raiding throughout Clay County, robbing and killing those who they suspected as being Union sympathizers. And yeah, this is the same Clay County where Frank was born and raised. Remember what I said earlier about the war there in Missouri being neighbor against neighbor. Some of the very same people that Frank was helping to kill, he had known for pretty much his entire life. And by late May of that same year, Frank and his compadres were camped out right there on the James farm, which, as it turns out, was probably not the greatest of ideas. A provisional militia out of nearby Clinton County soon caught wind and came a-calling. When they failed to locate Frank, they took the then 15-year-old Jesse James hostage. Legend has it that they beat him, possibly going so far as poking at him with their sabers. And while Jesse remained strong and refused to divulge his brother's whereabouts, the same cannot be said for his stepfather, Reuben Samuel. The Provisionals ended up placing a noose around Reuben's neck and jerking him up into the air. After several minutes of torture, he finally broke and led him through the woods to where Frank and the others were camped. There was a brief firefight. Some of the guerrillas were killed, but luckily for Frank, he was able to escape. Reuben and Zerelda were then hauled to the district headquarters over in St. Joseph, while Jesse was left on the farm to look after his younger siblings. Meanwhile, Frank and the bushwhackers took their frustrations out on the town of Lawrence, Kansas. Now, this was partly in retaliation for what had just recently occurred in Kansas City. The family members of several suspected bushwhackers were arrested and being held there in an old building. And when the building tragically collapsed, people died. Among the dead were two of Bill Anderson's sisters, as well as a female cousin of another gorilla you'll end up hearing much more about here shortly, named Cole Younger. It was almost certainly a total accident, but nevertheless, the guerrillas were looking for retribution. Also, Lawrence was sort of the de facto Jayhawker capital there in Kansas, in addition to being home of Quantrell's former mentor and current enemy, James Lane. Shortly before the attack, Quantrell ordered his men to, quote, kill, and you will make no mistake. Lawrence should be thoroughly cleansed, and the only way to cleanse it is to kill. And yeah, kill they did. Pretty much every single man and boy they could find. Those hiding were dragged out of their holes and executed. Some were shot, some stabbed, and others simply clubbed to death. Per a Lawrence resident, quote, the horsemanship of the guerrillas was perfect. They rode with that ease and abandon which are acquired by a life spent in the saddle amid desperate scenes. Their horses scarcely seemed to touch the ground, and the riders set upon them with bodies erect and arms perfectly free, with revolvers at full cock, shooting at every house and man they passed, and yelling like demons at every bound. On each side of this stream of fire were men fallen dead and wounded, and women and children, half-dressed, running and screaming, some trying to escape from danger, and some rushing to the side of their murdered friends. All total, Frank and the Raiders killed around 200 people, the vast majority of whom were non-combatants. People that had nothing to do with that building collapse over there in Kansas City. These were just normal, everyday people just trying to live their lives. Cole Younger would later aptly describe it as a day of butchery. Now, if you're looking for a pretty decent portrayal of the Lawrence Massacre, I'd strongly suggest checking out Ride with the Devil, starring Tobey Maguire. Yeah, Spider-Man. But don't worry, it is a way underrated movie that, in my opinion, gives a pretty realistic picture of the Missouri bushwhackers. It also has Jewel, so hey, win-win. Now, later on that winter, Frank would join Quantrell down in Texas. He and his buddies wouldn't return to Missouri until the following spring, and it's at that point that the now 16-year-old Jesse James got his big chance. In his book, Jesse James, The Last Rebel, T.J. Stiles summed it up best when he wrote, quote, it was a savage set of men who returned with Frank that April. Already hardened by war, they had been blistered by butchery at Lawrence and debauchery in Texas. And Charles Fletcher Taylor, the man who led the small squad that crossed over to Clay County, was one of the hardest. Short, broad-shouldered, sporting a neatly trimmed mustache and beard, Fletch had fought with Quantrell since the beginning, scouting out Lawrence before the raid, murdering the innocent in its streets, and then riding to Texas. But there he turned against his master, murdering a Confederate officer and resisting Quantrell's attempt to arrest him. Now he fought on his own hook. Cantering beside him was an even smaller, even more vicious killer, little Archie Clement, a gray-eyed 18-year-old from Johnson County. Barely 5 feet tall, he looked more like a jockey than a gorilla, but he was already an experienced gunman, and he would soon win the lasting admiration of Frank's little brother. These were the men who brought Jesse James to manhood. End of quote, and well said, Mr. Stiles. Now, starting in early June, Fletcher led the guerrillas, Jesse James included, throughout Clay County, killing Union loyalists, or just those who they suspected of being loyalists. Their first victim was an old boy named Bradley Bond. They rode up to his farm, asked to see the man in the house, and when Bradley stepped outside, they shot him dead. The next morning, they likewise killed a neighboring farmer named Alvis Dagley. Both of these guys, by the way, Dagley and Bond, were thought to have been part of that militia that beat Jesse and put the noose around his stepfather's neck. If true, I do think there's a good chance that one of these men may have been Jesse's first kill. Over the course of the next couple weeks, they'd kill at least 8 more Union sympathizers. Property was stolen and or destroyed, and on at least one occasion, they shot one of their victims' slaves just for the fun of it. And yeah, this was basically Jesse's introduction to war. Not as a soldier on the battlefield, but as a member of what can best be described as a death squad, just slowly picking off men that he and Frank had previously considered to be neighbors. Hell, it wasn't until they killed fellow Clay County resident Solomon Bigelow that Jesse even experienced being shot at. A brief skirmish that resulted in Bigelow's death and Jesse getting the tip of his left index finger shot plumb off. The following day, they murdered a civilian they encountered on the road, just on suspicion that he was a Unionist. And on and on and on it went. A lot of killing going on in Missouri during the 1860s. I keep wanting to say Missouri, but I think that's because I've watched too much Outlaw Josie Wells, so I'm going to stick with Missouri. Okay. By mid-July of 1864, a former militiaman would write that a, quote, general terror prevails. Today there is not in the county of Clay one unconditional, loyal Union man who dare goes into the harvest field to do a day's work. Many of them have left the state. All are now talking of going. A week later, on the 20th, around 1,500 locals met in the town of Liberty to further condemn the bushwhackers. Quote, guerrillas, whatever the name they assume, and bushwhackers are the ravenous monsters of society, and their speedy and utter extermination should be sought by all brave and honorable men. End of quote. Now, I bring this up just to show that not everybody there in Missouri were fans of the bushwhackers, even in Little Dixie. The majority may have supported them, but certainly not everybody. Hell, like I keep saying, up till this point, the only people that Jesse had been killing were his own damn neighbors. That would change a few weeks later, though, when the gang headed west into Platte County and attacked the town of Parkville. This was followed on July 10th by a similar assault on Platte City. If you've ever seen that photo of a young Jesse James, where he looks like he's about 12 years old, revolver in hand, and 2 more stuffed in his belt, that photograph was taken right there in Platte City. And Jesse, still 2 months shy of his 17th birthday, already had the dead eyes of a stone-cold killer. Once the bushwhackers were done looting Platte, they rode north and murdered a minister who just so happened to be anti-slavery. This was followed by Jesse and Archie Clement allegedly gunning down a pair of Union men they caught picking apples. As you can imagine, things were getting a little hot there in Clay County, as evidenced by around 500 Union troops arriving looking to clean house. And that being the case, the guerrillas wisely chose to split up and scatter to the wind. The damage was already done, though. They had either killed or ran off most of the families in the area still loyal to the North. Those who remained either supported the Confederates or knew how to keep their mouths shut. This is also around the same period that Jesse and Frank joined up with Bloody Bill Anderson. I'm not going to lie, it's kind of hard to keep up with a lot of these names. Remember, Frank initially rode with William Quantrell, as well as another guerrilla leader there in Clay County known as Fernando Scott. He and Jesse would then go on to fight alongside Fletch Taylor, and eventually, by 1864, they were with Bloody Bill Anderson. I'm not sure why they didn't continue riding with Fletcher. If you happen to know, hit me up at josh@wildwestextra.com and enlighten me. But I do know there was a lot of disagreement among the various guerrilla leaders, and a lot of fracturing at different points. I'm not going to go too in-depth on it today, but as Mr. Stiles alluded to a moment ago, there was even a point when Quantrell and Anderson were gunning for one another. Now, speaking of Anderson, he originally hailed from Kentucky. I'll try not to hold that against him. And by the time he was a teenager, he and his family were residing in Kansas, which, let's be honest, ain't much of an improvement over Kentucky. And despite Anderson nowadays being lauded as a hero, he was pretty much just a two-bit thief. He would even readily admit that his main motivations were financial as opposed to ideological, at least towards the beginning of the war. He and his gang wouldn't join up with Quantrell's raiders until the spring of 1863, right about the same time that Frank started riding with him. Then, of course, later on that summer was when Bill's sisters were killed over in Kansas City. Fellow bushwhacker Jim Cummings would later say of Anderson, quote, "You talk about Quantrell, Todd, and Taylor being reckless raiders and fighters, but Anderson was worse than any of them." And yeah, it's from Anderson, along with his right-hand man, the maniacal little Archie Clement, that the James boys would receive a master class in guerrilla tactics. This episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is brought to you in part by Mint Mobile. 2025 is here, and Mint Mobile has a resolution for you. Skip the gym, skip the fad diets, skip the BS resolutions you'll forget about by next month. Instead, make a resolution to save some serious cash by making the switch to Mint Mobile. And right now, you can get half off their 3-month unlimited plan. Look, I made the switch to Mint Mobile last year, and I've seen zero difference in wireless service. I still get a great signal, but at a fraction of the cost. Simply put, it works. And right now, Mint Mobile is dropping huge savings for the new year by offering any 3-month plan for only $15 a month, even their unlimited plan. All plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. You can even bring your own current phone and number. So come on, switch to Mint Mobile, and new customers can get half off an unlimited plan until February 2nd. To get your new wireless plan for just $15 a month and get the plan shipped to your door for free, go to mintmobile.com/Wild West. That's mintmobile.com/Wild West. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slow above 30 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. This episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is also brought to you by DraftKings. I can't believe it's already January, but hey, here we are. And you know what that means. It's playoff time. And what better way to enjoy the playoffs than by getting in on the action at DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. Look, we all know scoring touchdowns is key to winning in the playoffs, right? Someone needs to tell that to the Texans, but I think the rest of us know that. Well, you too can score big by betting on DraftKings. If it's your first time, you can even try something as easy as picking a player to score 6. Just go to the DraftKings Sportsbook app and make your pick. And just to make things even more simple, DraftKings gives you lines and odds for each and every game. Just please keep in mind that those lines and odds are subject to change. So what are you waiting on? Download DraftKings Sportsbook app and use code WILDWEST. That's code WILDWEST for new customers to get $200 in bonus bets instantly when you bet just $5. Only on DraftKings Sportsbook. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369. In Connecticut, HOPE is available for problem gambling. Call 887-89-7777 or visit ccpg.org. Please play responsibly. On behalf of Boot Hill Casino and Resort, Kansas. 21 plus age and eligibility varies by jurisdiction. Void in Ontario. Bonus bets expire 168 hours after issuance. For additional terms and responsible gaming resources, see dkng.co/audio. And now, let's get back to the story. They kicked off the spring of 1864 by cutting a swath of terror across Jackson and Lafayette counties. In July, they gunned down 9 civilians in Carroll County. They continued raiding further east all the way to Monroe County. And by August of 64, they were right back in Jesse's home turf and camped out on the James farm. It's there where Jesse's mother, Zerelda, prepared what was described as a splendid feast. Kind of makes you wonder how much of the food she cooked as opposed to the slaves. Not long thereafter, the bushwhackers came across a Union man, described by locals as harmless and inoffensive. But regardless, they shot him full of lead, stripped his body, and left his harmless corpse to rot there on the banks of a creek. This may or may not have been after Jesse witnessed Anderson torturing a prisoner with a knife. Eventually, Bloody Bill put the man out of his misery with a bullet to the head, but not before first removing his ears. Skip ahead to mid-August, and they engage elements of the Missouri militia over in Ray County. Finally, fighting people who can actually shoot back. Now, 2 of the U.S. soldiers who surrendered had their throats cut and scalps taken. And when a civilian made the grave mistake of riding past in a wagon, Anderson's men murdered him too. This was followed by Jesse James damn near getting his young ass killed. Story goes that Jesse spied a nice-looking saddle propped up against a fence. And when he approached, thinking that he could swap it out for his own, the saddle's owner stepped outside and put a bullet squarely in Jesse's chest. Thankfully, Frank was on hand to whisk his brother to safety. In due course, they stole a wagon and hauled Jesse to the home of a friend named John Rudd. The doctor who was summoned to treat his wounds would later recall being shown to a, quote, room in the second story, and then into a clothes closet, from the floor of which a small movable ladder reached to a trapdoor opening into a loft. There lay Jesse James in great pain and in a very dangerous condition. As it turns out, the bullet had gone through and through. Hit just outside his right nipple, nicked his rib cage, but other than that, Jesse was all right. The sawbones cleaned the holes, changed the bandages, most likely gave him a little something for the pain, and promised to return. And just 4 weeks later, Jesse James was back in the saddle, just in time to help Anderson ambush a Missouri State Militia wagon train, killing a dozen soldiers and 3 Teamsters while doing so. And it was on the next day, September 24th, 1864, that Anderson linked back up with William Quantrell and George Todd. Guess they figured they'd set their differences aside in order to strike a decisive blow against the Federals. Apparently, General Price was getting ready to, air quotes, liberate Missouri, and he needed the bushwhackers' help. This combined force, by the way, with Anderson Todd and Quantrell's men, numbered somewhere between 200 to 400 hardened killers. And later on that morning, Bloody Bill, with Archie Clement and the James boys in tow, attempted to hit the town of Fayette against the advice of William Quantrell, mostly on account of Fayette being home to the pro-Union 9th Missouri. And sure enough, the attack turned out to be a disaster. Although the rebels were able to infiltrate the town in their borrowed blue uniforms, one of them couldn't help but to gun down the first black dude he saw. And after that, the fight was on. According to Frank James, their horses fell like grain before the reaper. Said it was like charging a stone wall, only if the wall was belching lead. And despite being repulsed, the James boys would account well for themselves, both stopping to render aid to their fallen comrades. Once again, according to Frank, quote, "We were in plain view of the Federals, and they simply peppered us with bullets. I was mighty scared. I knew if we raised up, we would expose ourselves to the fire of the Yankees, but we couldn't lay still. I tell you, pride makes most of us do things we wouldn't otherwise do. Well, pride kept us there until we got the wounded rolled up in a blanket, and then we made tracks." End quote. All total, the bushwhackers lost 13 killed and around 30 wounded before making their retreat. And despite outnumbering the militia 3-1, they only managed to kill a couple of them. Just ain't no two ways about it. As capable as the guerrillas were, they most definitely got their asses handed to them there in Fayette. Luckily for them, and unluckily for several Yankee soldiers on furlough, things would go much better 3 days later when they struck the town of Centralia. As was their M.O., they descended upon the populace in a fury, wearing the blue uniforms of dead U.S. soldiers, ransacking stores and plundering homes. But that wasn't really what they were there for. You see, Centralia was a depot for the North Missouri Railroad, and when a train came a chug-a-lug-lugging through later on that day, the guerrillas were waiting. They had piled heavy wooden ties on the tracks and began dinging the train with gunfire as it ground to a halt. Once stopped, the rebels entered and took 23 unarmed soldiers captive. These men, most of whom were part of Sherman's army, were simply returning home on R&R. Some of them were wounded, and as I mentioned, all of them, to a man, were unarmed. Anderson made the soldiers strip down to their long johns and then ordered them paroled, i.e. executed. When Little Arch Clement suggested that he keep one of them alive to act as a bargaining chip, Bill agreed, singling out a sergeant. The rest were then unceremoniously gunned down. Those who weren't immediately killed had their heads bashed in or throats cut. This was followed by the bushwhackers robbing the frightened civilian passengers. When one of them balked at handing over his possessions, they killed him too. Once done, they set the train on fire and hightailed it out of town. Worth noting that it was Archie Clement who led that execution. One can only speculate, but I do think the odds are pretty good that either Jesse or Frank, or maybe even both, were part of the firing squad. Either way, the massacre at Centralia may have been over, but there was still plenty more killing to come. No sooner had the bushwhackers made camp that evening than a scout came riding in with news of the enemy's approach. Turns out it was a detachment of around 115 men under Major Andrew Johnston, part of the 39th Missouri Infantry. When he and his men discovered what happened at Centralia, they went in pursuit, despite the traumatized citizens warning them not to. Sure enough, the guerrillas had set up an ambush, and as Johnston approached, Anderson sent one of his best men, Dave Poole, to lure him the rest of the way into the kill zone. Oldest trick in the book, right? You send a few fast runners on ahead, make it look like they were caught by surprise, and your enemy invariably will follow. I have to imagine this tactic was taught in military academies prior to the Civil War. It must have been. But nonetheless, Major Johnston fell for it. And in doing so, he led over 100 men, most of whom were fresh recruits, straight to their graves. As soon as the soldiers entered the open meadow, on foot by the way, Anderson ordered the guerrillas forward at a trot. The Federals let loose with a volley of rifle fire with little effect. That's when the bushwhackers charged, screaming war cries as their companions spilled out from a nearby ravine. The result was a perfect slaughter. Like I said earlier, nearly every man of the 39th Missouri was killed. Those who managed to survive fled to the nearby town of Sturgeon, as Dave Poole danced on the bodies of their fallen brothers. Like he literally danced on the bodies of the dead soldiers. Other bushwhackers busied themselves taking scalps and ears, and at least one of the soldiers had his damn nose cut off. As for Jesse James, well, it turns out he was the one who did for Major Johnston. Story goes that after blowing the officer out of the saddle, Jesse turned his mount and delivered a coup de grace straight to the major's head. Full disclosure, but there are other stories claiming that while it was indeed Jesse who shot Major Johnston off his horse, it may have possibly been another bushwhacker who delivered that fatal round to Johnston's head. Meanwhile, by mid-September, Sterling Price was leading that rebel army of his in what they hoped to be the liberation of Missouri. They attacked Fort Richardson on the 24th, one of the largest battles fought in the state of Missouri. It was also a resounding defeat for the Confederates. Not only did Price lose around 1,500 men, but the survivors were forced to leave the state altogether. Hell, in time, they'd flee the entire country, migrating to Mexico until the fall of Emperor Maximilian in 1867. But that's another story for another day. Before leaving Missouri, Price ordered the bushwhackers to destroy the North Missouri Railroad. And instead of immediately setting out to do as they were told, they instead decided to terrorize the town of Glasgow over in Howard County. I'm not really sure what the motivation was here, other than maybe Glasgow being home to a wealthy Union man named Benjamin Lewis. A guy who had the absolute gall to free his own slaves. You imagine that? And for such a grave sin, Lewis was viciously beaten by Bloody Bill Anderson. If that ain't enough, Anderson then stole $5,000 from Lewis and then raped one of his female servants right in front of him, a 12-year-old black girl. Lewis would die of his injuries the following day, and sadly, I don't have any idea what happened to that little girl. Still astounds me when I hear people singing Anderson's praises. I mean, what a brave hero he was, beating civilians to death, gunning down unarmed soldiers, and raping children. What a patriot. Thankfully, nearly 2 weeks later, Anderson finally got what he had coming, at the hands of avenging angel and true Southerner, Colonel Samuel Cox. He and his specially trained 33rd Infantry made contact with Anderson's pickets on the morning of October 27th, just west of Albany, Missouri. Cox positioned his men in the trees just outside of town and then sent a small detachment to lure the bushwhackers into an ambush, much in the same way that the guerrillas had done to Major Johnston back at Centralia. And it worked. As Cox and his soldiers waited, they heard the sound of gunfire. This was followed by their scouts rushing back to the line, closely pursued by none other than Bloody Bill Anderson and somewhere between 20 to 50 of his men. And just as soon as they were within range, Cox's riflemen unleashed hell. Rebels began toppling from their horses as others wheeled and retreated in the opposite direction. All except for Anderson and just one other man, guy historians think was possibly Captain John Rains, son of Confederate General James S. Rains. The pair charged headlong, pistols blazing, before Bloody Bill was shot from the saddle. His companion, miraculously, was able to turn his mount and make it back to the rebels unscathed. Anderson's body was then taken to Richmond, decapitated, and dragged through the streets. His head was placed on a telegraph pole, and his corpse buried in an unmarked grave. Rumor has it his pecker was also cut off before burial. Later on that day, the men of the 33rd Infantry took turns spitting and pissing on Anderson's grave. Now that was on October 26, 1864, when Bloody Bill went on to his heavenly reward. And by the 29th, the James boys were once again back home in Clay County. They knocked on the door of a Union man, pretended to ask for directions, and when he stepped outside, they shot him dead. This would be repeated later on that same day when they killed an elderly man named Ferran. Jesse James had only been gone to war for 5 months, but in that short amount of time, he had been shot twice and took God only knows how many lives. At just 17 years of age, he likely hadn't even slept with a woman yet, but he was already an accomplished killer, and apparently he had no intention of slowing down. That said, he and his brother wouldn't remain there in Clay County all that long. Frank decided to join Quantrell and continue the fight over in Kentucky, as Jesse drifted south to Texas with Archie Clement and what remained of Anderson's bushwhackers. They would return the following spring, though, a combined force of around 150 guerrillas under the leadership of Archie Clement, Dave Poole, and Anderson's brother, Jim. By this point, General Lee had already surrendered, by the way, but they dismissed the reports as just another damn Yankee lie. Fake news. And on May 7th, at around 2 a.m., they charged through the town of Holden, killing at least one bystander and looting a store before heading 5 miles down the road to Kingsville. They donned their trademark blue overcoats at the edge of town, the ones they took off dead U.S. soldiers, And by the time they left, there were 8 bodies and 5 burning buildings in their wake. One of their victims, the postmaster, was killed by Jesse himself. And then, just a few weeks after that, Jesse's war would come to a temporary end. Sources differ, but it's thought he was helping Archie Clement scout out a likely crossing on the Missouri River when they stumbled upon a small patrol of soldiers from the 3rd Wisconsin. And for once, the guerrillas were a little too slow on the draw. Before they even knew what happened, the soldiers opened fire and put a bullet in Jesse's chest, just inches from where he was shot a few months prior, a bullet he'd end up carrying for the rest of his life. According to Jesse, as soon as he was hit, he turned to kill one of the soldiers' horses. Quote, "That'll stop a man every time. That ended the fight. I was near a creek and I lay in the water all night. I felt as if I was burning up. The next morning I crawled up the bank and there was a man plowing nearby who helped me get to my friends. I was in a dreadful fix and everybody thought that the wound would be mortal." End quote. Just an FYI, but Jesse would later claim that he was riding to Lexington to surrender and carrying a white flag, but the Yanks ended up opening fire. And that very well may be true. Whatever the case, though, for the second time in his young life, Jesse James was horribly wounded. And considering that the bullet had punctured a lung, this time it would take a lot longer than 4 weeks till he was again able to sit a saddle. How things were so dire that his fellow rebels even loaded him onto a wagon and risked carrying him to Lexington. This time, no shots were fired, and Jesse was able to get some proper doctoring. He was also officially taken as a prisoner of war. At least for a little bit. Remember, the Civil War was basically over. And despite Jesse being more outlawed than soldier, he still got paroled right alongside everybody else. And it wasn't just him. As he lay there on what many thought would be his deathbed, his bushwhacking compadres also started straggling into Lexington, likewise looking to surrender. Frank would do the same over in Kentucky just a few weeks later following the death of Quantrell. Now, Jesse would stay in Lexington for about a month before being transferred, once again via wagon, to his uncle's place just north of Kansas City. At the time, his mother and stepfather were living in exile in Nebraska. According to a friend, Jesse was emaciated, tottering as he walked, and fighting what seemed to everyone a hopeless battle. His wound would not heal. And more ominous, every now and then there was a hemorrhage. End of quote. So yeah, dude was in pretty serious shape. Thankfully, he had his smoking hot first cousin Z to nurse him back to health. And cousins or not, they apparently made quite the impression on one another. This is just the beginning of a courtship that would eventually culminate in their marriage in 1874. Z, by the way, was named after Jesse's mother, Zerelda. Got to imagine it'd be a bit awkward getting hitched to someone with the same name as your mom, but hey, to each their own. More on these lovebirds here in a bit, but as Jesse struggled to stay in the land of the living, things there in Missouri continued to worsen. All throughout the state, those who had been loyal to the Republic suffered greatly at the hands of the guerrillas. And these same people, at least the ones who survived, were outraged to learn that the bushwhackers would be treated like regular soldiers when they surrendered. All they had to do was take that same oath that Jesse and Frank took, and that was it. They could then return home without fearing retribution. Official retribution, that is. You see, the Missourians who fought for the North were also returning home. They too were battle-hardened and armed to the teeth. And that's another thing. Prior to hostilities, almost nobody in Missouri owned a revolver. Now everybody did, even the little kids. And most of them owned multiple. There's a great photo of one of the bushwhacker leaders, Dave Poole, carrying a whopping 4 revolvers, 1 in his hand and 3 more strapped to his waist. Frank James would later claim that he never carried more than 2, but there are stories of him stalking the streets of Kearney, Missouri, sporting a total of 8 revolvers. And his buddy, Archie Clement, was said to have gone through at least 11 of them during the fight that cost him his life, which we will be discussing later. These dudes were absolutely armed to the gills, but then again, so was pretty much everybody else. In other words, despite the Confederates losing, Missouri remained extremely violent following the war's end. And a good deal of this centered around politics. What else is new, right? Seems like pretty much everything bad comes from politics. It's a lot to get into here. I may expand on this later on in the series. But especially after the war, when the so-called radical Republicans had the run of the state, they were enacting a lot of laws that proved very unpopular. For instance, if you served in the Confederate Army, or even supported the Confederates in pretty much any capacity, then you weren't allowed to vote. You couldn't hold public office. Hell, you couldn't even be a teacher or a minister. This didn't set too well with many of the former Confederates there in Missouri. They also weren't too happy about the former slaves having freedom. And it was all of this that absolutely led to more than a little post-war strife. Now, as far as Jesse James is concerned, he would finally return home to his mama's farm in October of '64. A family friend would later state that Jesse then joined the local Baptist church. Quote, I think he was baptized, and for a year or two acted as if he were a sincere and true Christian. He was quiet, affable, and gentle in his actions. He was liked by everyone who knew him. Okay, maybe. I mean, hey, I do enjoy a nice testimony. But then again, by early 1866, I guess Jesse was having second thoughts as the old gang was once more back together. Archie Clements returned from Texas, as did Jim Anderson, and his brother Frank was back in Clay County by that point as well. Oath or no oath, they remained unreconstructed. And for the James boys especially, things were just getting started. And on that note, I think that's about as good a place as any to wrap things up. Thank you so much for listening. This is part 1 in an ongoing series on Jesse James, so please join me here next Wednesday for part 2. We'll discuss Jesse's actions post-war, his first historic bank robbery, and his gradual rise to fame. Until then, do me and hopefully yourself a favor by signing up for the 100% free Wild West newsletter. You can go to my website, wildwestextra.com, and sign up there, or just head over to the newsletter directly at wildwestnewsletter.com. Like I said, it's free, and it's just a way for me to occasionally send you cool or interesting stories I find out about the Old West. Think of it as a companion piece to this podcast. All right, till then, maybe try to be a little better than Jesse James was when it comes to dodging bullets. Don't go scalping anybody or cutting their ears off. And please, whatever you do, don't hook up with your own first cousin, okay? Especially if she's got the same name as your mother. All right, till next time, adios.